So much for coming all the way here to the GC, the Graduate Center, CUNY. We're thrilled to have you here. My name is Mila Burns. I'm Associate Director at the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies here at the Graduate Center, CUNY. This is our first official event in partnership with Dominican Studies Institute at CUNY. So I'm even more excited to be doing that. We've done a lot of events on the DR and, of course, the Caribbean and everywhere in Latin America. But this is the first official partnership. Pierre actually launched his book in an event last year with us. So I invite you all to also be following us on our social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, so that you can know about our upcoming events. We have another book launch on April 20th, not a book launch of a translation of a book, a Brazilian novel called Vista Chinesa. And this event is on April 20th. On April 24th, we have a big concert celebrating the 50th anniversary of Expresso 2222, Gilberto Gil's amazing album. So you're all welcome to be here. All of our events are free and open to the public. For those of you who don't know us, the CLECOS, as we call it, is a center that supports students in general here at the Graduate Center. We have summer fellowships. Actually, Chelsea Schields was one of our fellows a few years ago. She was also a very good friend here for me at the GC. So I'm even more thrilled to have this event with her here today. We also do, as you know, a series of events. Besides the fellowships, we have the Latino Data Project, which is a unique project in terms of producing reports about Latinos living in the United States, especially in New York City. And we also are home for many visiting scholars, students who stop by the city to conduct research. So if you have any connections with Latin America, the Caribbean, or Latino studies, we are your home here in New York as well, okay? So as I said, please follow us if you can. Thank you so much, Pierre, for putting this together, Ramona Hernandez and all your team at the Dominican Studies Institute. And thank you, speakers, for being here, Margo. Thank you so much for sharing your brilliant research with us. I'm looking forward to hearing more from you. Thank you all so much.
I won't be too long. My name is Pierre Lawson. I'm the Associate Director of the Dominican Studies Institute. And it's great to be back because I'm an alum also from the Graduate Center. And I was a summer fellow of CLACS also a few years ago. Yes. And thank you, Mila. Thank you, Andreina. We know you've worked very hard to put together this event. So thanks for hosting us today. This is, well, as Mila mentioned, the first official collaboration that we have with CLACS at the Graduate Center. And so I'm happy to be here to introduce Dr. Margo Groenewoud, who is the first ever, as far as I know, Fulbright Scholar-in-Residence at City College. So it's an honor that she chose to join us at the Dominican Studies Institute. And I think her presence at the Institute is very important because it allows us to think and research the Dominican Republic, not in isolation or really as half of an island, but as an entity within a larger space, which shares commonalities with other islands and countries in the region, but also, of course, boasts its own specificities. And so as a research fellow as the Institute, Dr. Groenewoud expands upon her investigations of connection and kinship within the Dutch Caribbean to include the Dominican Republic. And she does archival research at our library and archives, and also conducts oral history research within Dutch Dominican communities, and trying to shed new lights on more than 500 years of relationship between Dominicans and the Dutch Caribbean. So Dr. Groenewoud obtained her PhD in Caribbean history from the University of Curaçao and Leiden University in the Netherlands. She is now a senior lecturer at University of Curaçao. Her topics of scholarship include social exclusion, citizenship, migration, and radicalism in the transnational Caribbean. Most recently, she has published in Clio Women Gender History in Small Acts and the Journal of Caribbean History. She is a consultant for the Digital Library of the Caribbean and a member of the editorial boards at CSA's Caribbean Conjunctures and of the Brill Caribbean Studies series. After we hear Margo's presentation, we'll hear a conversation with Dr. Chelsea Schields, who is joining us today from the University of California at Irvine, where she is an assistant professor of history and also another alum of the Graduate Center. Dr. Schields' scholarship explores the entwined histories of sexuality, energy, and empire in the 20th century Caribbean and Europe. She is the author of Offshore Attachments, Oil and Intimacy in the Caribbean, published by the University of California Press in 2023. And she is also the co-editor with Dagmar Herzog of the Routledge Companion to Sexuality and Colonialism. And she has also published in journals such as Radical History Review and Gender History. Thank you very much. Without further ado, Dr. Groenewoud.
Thank you so much, Mila, Pierre, for this wonderful introduction, and of course also for setting up this this event today. Thank you all present here and also online for your interest in the research and in the conversation, of course, with my good friend and scholar friend, Chelsea Schields. It's a pleasure being here, and like I said, it's not that I'm presenting you you know, a paper or a book that's already in print. I'm just sharing with you, well, not just, I'm sharing with you research that's in progress. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion also following this presentation. But before I start, I know that some people may not be too, you know, familiar with the Dutch Caribbean. So just to get a clear view of the Dutch and the Dutch Kingdom and the Dutch Caribbean, because the Dutch Caribbean is everything but Dutch in many regards. There's the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which is the legal sort of entity, and some of the islands within the Dutch Caribbean that are still part of the kingdom are countries, and Curaçao is one of them. The other one is Aruba, and the third one is Saint Martin. The other three smaller islands are municipalities, and they are governed from the Netherlands. Sounds very colonial. There are elements of democracy in there. It's complicated, but life on and governance on small islands is complicated. And this is where we are now since 2010. You will hear me refer mostly to Curaçao and Aruba, because those are the islands where there was some level of industry. And you will hear me talk about Saint Martin, because lots of people from Saint Martin went to the Dominican Republic. So you have some sort of basic view of where they came from. What's important to keep in mind is the languages, and that's very much when I say there's not much Dutch. You know, the first language on Curaçao, Bonaire, and Aruba is spoken language is Papiamentu. Only 16% of the people in Curaçao have Dutch as first language. So that's just a little bit. And then on the Windward Islands, so the smaller ones close to Puerto Rico, English is the first language. And many people, especially in the historical period I discuss, didn't even know much Dutch. So that's also important to keep in mind. So this just as a sort of basic understanding. So what does that mean for people living there and the demographics? Around 1920, when you did not have, well, you'd have the start of an oil refinery on Curacao. Mostly people in Curacao, the biggest islands, was white elites, Protestants from the Netherlands, Jewish people from originally Sephardic Jewish people, originally so from Spain and Portugal, and predominantly Black other population, of course, the formerly enslaved, and on Bonaire and Aruba, the people are mostly from Spanish and indigenous descent. So that's important to keep in mind, because of what happens when the oil refineries are established on Aruba and Curacao. And then you get this very complicated mix of fast growing population. But what happens is there are all sorts of labor migrants coming in from the other islands. On Curacao, people coming from Suriname, from the Windward Islands, and they often enter society higher level and the labor market at a higher level than the Afro-Curaçaoans. And that's a very important element to understand what's going on the islands, because the Afro-Curaçaoan population that comprises the majority of the population, like 85%, were not given much of opportunity to work in the oil refinery. So if you want to understand social exclusion, patterns of social exclusion, that's important. Now, this is just for an introduction. I can give a full talk about this, but it's good to keep that in mind. And something similar happens on Aruba when oil workers came in from the other islands. It was a first, larger presence of having a Black community in Aruba. That was new to them. So that's good to keep in mind. And I could quiz you, I will not, but people on, I could. Chelsea, the ones on the left, upper left, where is that?
Margo.
Exactly, St. Nicholas, Aruba, right up. I'm not putting you on the spot. It's also Aruba. And lower left is Curacao. And the lower right is also Curacao. And the funny thing is, when you know Curacao a little bit, there are people in Curacao who really associate Curacao more still with the lower right than the lower left picture. Now, that's just the introduction. Now about this presentation and the things I want to share with you. First, I want to tell you a little bit about this project, and because what I present now is like a first element in a larger project. And then we'll really look into these interactions between the Dutch Caribbean and the Dominican Republic. I'll share some first conclusions with you and give some idea about what I think follow-up should be for this research. And this illustration is by Nadal Walcott, an artist from San Pedro the Macoris. That's one of the sugar towns in the Dominican Republic that we will talk a lot about today. And his work really is very, I love to involve art as a source in my research, and his work definitely is of importance. Because he did a lot. And on the picture on the introduction on the flyer also is a mural by him. So where did it all start? Years ago, a fellow scholar asked me to search for something online, and it had to do with the Dominican Republic that I didn't know much about, and it had to do with Curacao and someone from the Dominican Republic in Curacao. So I was searching through newspapers and some other sources, and I found two things. These are just two, but there are several examples of announcements of fiestas, of parties on the island in which the Dominican Republic was, or the dictator at that time, Trujillo, was celebrated. And there are so many examples. And for me, I tend to make that comparison. It was like finding out that my European grandmother had danced at parties, paid for by Hitler. It was like, what's this? You can have that, but to have it all over the place, in the Catholic newspaper is very manifest. Hey, Jason. So I was shocked. At the same time, we're all trained as historians not to have, not to think anything, not to feel anything, and just to take things as they are and study them. So I did that. And in reading more about this part of the Caribbean and what happened, I stumbled upon this citation of Hickman, where he says about the US that they were not unwilling to tolerate full-blooded dictators. And often they flourished in unholy alliance. And that unholy alliances is something I took with me as part of the lens. So what I'm doing now is I'm looking at regional connections and interactions. And I started out saying, I'm going to study the Dutch, Spanish, Caribbean. I'm not using that any longer because it's very, it's the way that empires were organized, and we still tend to think in these language blocks, but that's, I think, not very helpful. But I looked at the era of dictatorships and Cold War. So obviously I'm looking at the Dominican Republic, but I will also look at Cuba and Venezuela at some as well. And I am interested in how people navigated these ideological and moral dilemmas that were everywhere, not just for politicians or diplomats, but for all sorts of people being involved in trade relations or just in trying to better their lives or family relations. This context was challenging, to say the least. And in my study, of course, I addressed the fact that in the Caribbean, language isn't everything. There was so much mobility that you have to look at how communities shaped and how interaction shaped. And this automatically brings about questions about belonging and citizenship. So this is sort of what I envision to do. And now let's start looking at the Dutch in the Dominican Republic. What we know is, I feel a bit like, sorry for the shaking. We know there is a longer history of family ties, especially the Sephardic Jewish merchants from Curaçao. They moved throughout the Caribbean and also landed in the Dominican Republic. So there are also many business ties. We know there are skilled workers from Curaçao. And then the sugar workers who started to enter the island from St. Martin and Curaçao in the late 19th century. And it's interesting to know that these sugar workers were not only the laborers on the floor, not doing the rough work only. The labor migration to the sugar industry very often involved possibilities to be like a overseer or develop in some part of the technical engineering going on there. So it was all levels of work. And I also know from what I found in the Dutch archives that there was a farmer's plan to bring some farmers in from the Dominican Republic. And I will publish about that because that was just, it was more hilarious than of historical value. But there was this plan. And, when you see 1937 and you study the Dominican Republic, of course you are, or of course, you're alerted because that was the year of the massacre of Trujillo, showing his colors in some way. I also found the Dutch being involved in a Catholic school being established in Dajabon, close to the border, and that started in 1945. So with this sort of general picture, I started my research looking for other elements of interaction, of contact, of Dutch people in the Dominican Republic in this era. And in the archives in the Dominican Republic in December, I looked through all these records of people once they left the ship, in the harbor. They came with a ship, landed there in the harbor, and it was often the same handwriting. So I imagined then this ship coming in, people very tired, they cannot really read and write mostly. Maybe they are tired, or they really have to go to the restroom, I don't know. And then there's this one person having to write everything down. Well, if someone, I have a funny name, but if someone writes my name down, I instantly see a misspelling, and I tell them, it's not Greenwood, it's Groenewoud, something like that. But you see in these records how very quickly things are changing for people. They are saying they are English when I think they meant that they were English speaking. Just an example. And if you look at the names, the first one, Juan Jose Richardson, I'm quite sure that this person was not born with the name Juan Jose. And these are not only the shipping lists, but also some legal documents that I cut and paste this from. Felipe van Putten, that's Philip van Putten. You see here Cornelio Patricio, who signs the same legal document with Cornelius Patricks, someone from St. Eustatius. So people very quickly blended in this community and even lost their names. And the same happened culturally. It was very easy, of course, for the people from St. Martin to blend in with the language, but also the religion. They were Protestant, not the ones from Curacao. The Leeward Islands are Catholic because of the Catholic mission there. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And then there were all sorts of affiliations, lodges, the Masonic lodges, and also the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the Garvey movement, who had chapters everywhere, and also here in the sugar industry. There we are. Recreation became an element of blending in, and also reputation. So the people from St. Martin very quickly are found in, for instance, the Garvey movement, doing all sorts of work that is surprising to me, because I know of the social exclusions on the Dutch islands themselves. But once these people entered this new society in San Pedro the Macoris, they pop up in new positions and are considered of value, for instance, in their association or in their lodge. There we are. And that had some consequences. As we know from the Garvey papers, there were relatively, we're not talking about hundreds of people, not even, 30 or something, but there were quite a lot of people who played an important role in the UNIA in San Pedro de Macoris, in the criticism and the demonstrations against the racist and there were women involved as well, the patriarchal way of treatments. And these are the names that keep appearing, and names also of people being deported eventually. That's what happened to people who criticized the governance there. And one of them is Thomas Duro, who went to Aruba, and apparently, and I say apparently, I have no reasons not to believe this, but there's the archival material is very scarce. There, I don't know of any evidence, but just knowing this from secondary sources that he started a new UNIA chapter there in Aruba.
What is UNIA?
UNIA is the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and that's the organization that the Jamaican Marcus Garvey started in 1916. He also was, expelled. He came to New York and rapidly developed this movement in a multi-million people movement, which was active in most port cities here in the US, but also in the Caribbean. So that was a network that people in the colonies, the governments, and business people were really afraid of, because Marcus Garvey was the one who said, buy black, who even started his own business. Well, not he, but the movement started black businesses. And the movement was very important for developing a sense of pride and for emancipation. And this in a transnational environment where there was a lot of movement of people, of course, brought a high risk for colonial enterprises. And just to add on this, in historiography in the Dutch Caribbean, we hardly know of anti-colonialism. So that's one of the sort of side steps I'm making now as a result of this research, that I will be writing an article about this, this whole movement that happened with people from the Dutch Caribbean being in these sugar environments, becoming active, being in communication with each other. What happened is this Philip van Putten, together with James and Alex Cooks, they come to New York, they are active here, and their son, Carlos A. Cooks, he becomes very active in his own, in several, the African Blood Brotherhood. He's the one of Black is Beautiful movement. He even has a street named after him by now. Quite frankly, when I was still in Curacao, I thought that was quite something. But now that I am in New York, I think, it's, but still, it's quite something. And I also found other names of people originating from the Dutch islands in the Garvey papers. And an article about the Dutch Caribbean in the Negro world that was sent from Havana. What I also found, and this is all found in the Schomburg Library, is a newspaper clipping in which there was just one act of protest in this era in Curacao, and that was a harbor strike of 1922. And here you see the importance of the transnational connections, that in New Orleans, a ship is not being loaded as a sign of solidarity with the Dutch harbor strike in Curacao. And for me as a historian, knowing the historiography, this is very exciting. It may be small bits and pieces, but it's a whole new narrative. Maybe I should turn it around. Okay, we move now from the 20s into the 30s, and there's a lot going on there. 1932 was when Trujillo became, the dictator of the Dominican Republic. And of course, in 33, Hitler came in power in Germany. And one of the things I found, and that I think is interesting, is that the Dutch really feared a German Dominican relation. And I found evidence of that in the archives, that the Dominican consul in Amsterdam, Hans Tietje, was originally from Germany. And he instantly wanted to make his move to improve business relations with the Dutch, with the Dominican Republic. And then the Dutch government in Curacao instantly was alerted, fearing some sort of an easy flow of people coming in from Germany and sort of bringing with them their whatever into the Caribbean. And some other thing that I found was that there was this awareness with the Dutch government about what happened in the Dominican Republic. I found evidence of that also in the archives, where there was this communication about people having to register. Dutch people being in the Dominican Republic had to register, and if not, apparently there was a danger for them, and these were Black people, and the situation would become dangerous without the protection of being Dutch. So the Dutch government was aware of what happened, was aware of the racial element in the threats and the actual violence in the Dominican Republic against Blacks, and they were aware it was not only anti-Haitian, like April Mays also tells us. It was racist in general, and also against Black people from, for instance, the Dutch Caribbean. And this for me was a big find, because it looked like the things I showed you at the beginning. It was like the Netherlands just were not aware what was going on there with their fiestas in Curaçao and their masses and everything. Well, they knew about that. This was a big find for me also in the archives. They knew about this. But then something interesting happens. There's war in Europe. There is The Hague is now at distance, and what happens in the Dutch Caribbean? They suddenly get very close with the Dominican Republic. You see here the visit of the Queen Juliana in the 40s. You see the Curaçao Trading Company, who had still a very, very big business here in the region, changed their statutory city, base from Amsterdam to Curacao. So the Dominican Republic being very active in that business, but also the Royal Dutch Airline, KLM, all these businesses started to jump up and seize their opportunities with the full support of the local leadership in Curacao. So the Dutch from Europe were more at distance because of the war, and the local leadership just seized their opportunities to build all these businesses. And the church was involved in that too. Like I told you, there was a school close to the border in Dajabon, where Dutch Catholic religious people were sent to establish one of the schools. Edward Paulino writes about that in his book on what happened on the border. And he says there were Cuban priests there helping out. But I found out that, and that's the man on the left-hand side in black, he was sent. And this for me is a very important case for that element of how did sort of normal people navigate these dilemmas, because this priest was sent from Curaçao, totally unaware of where he was sent to. And once he got there in Dajabón, and someone told him about what happened there in 1937, and why there was this school, and that there was this whole agenda of the Trujillo dictatorship, trying to improve the race there and to build a Dominican culture there. And he was, you could say, used for that. What should he do? Should he be a political person moving out, or a religious person staying there? Because people are people. These kids in these schools can't help being born there. What do you think he chose? Leaving or staying? What would you do?
You could be both. You can use your power of the church to educate and to help. So you stay. And you try to be a little bit of a radical and do it in a way that, because you have the backing of the church, you can get away with certain things that are normal civilian wouldn't be able to. That's what I would do.
Usually the Catholic Church is going to back the dictator, like in what happened later this Bible. The church is going to be with the military against them.
It's a dilemma,
I
right?
think that's more typical.
Yeah, you can think one thing one day and another thing. He stayed, and I trust you will not publish on this because it's still to be published, but he will suffer from something that I found a lot in the archives. I did a lot of work on missionary churches, and well, we're online, so maybe I should. He really suffered. Let me state that he really suffered from that. So to round up what happened with the Dutch in the Dominican Republic, we know that there were around about 700 sugar workers there. And they were young men coming there. They had children, lots of them had children there. But in this document that I found in the archives of 1947, this was an official communication between The Hague and the Council. There is a list of only 15 people considered Dutch in the eyes of the Council, so getting the support of the consulate there. But we know there were other peoples. I don't have all the answers, but what I know is that the way we look now at citizenship, well, I know my visa, I've discussed visas with Kier, I can discuss visas with a lot of you, and it's like a headache, you know, it's complicated today. You know your citizenship, you know how to travel and your options, etc. But in these days, that was more fluid, and apparently people stayed there sort of under the radar, or they moved to the US. That's an option as well. So this is what I wanted to share with you for this part of my research. Am I taking too much time? Because I think, yeah, I'll speed up a little. Okay, what we know about Dominicans in Curaçao and Aruba is, first of all, we know Trujillo restricted travel. Why would you travel? Why would you leave? Your country needs you. And we know also there was a very low percentage of laborers in the oil industry coming from the DR. We also know there was a regular shipping line. So there was, and we also know there was a constant flow of Dominican sex workers. And the earliest evidence of, you know, how that was arranged, I found was from 1937, where the captain of the ship going to Curaçao would assess the ability of the lady who wanted to board, perhaps not having the money and the papers needed to come to Curaçao, but he would assess whether she would be able to earn that money quickly once arriving in Curaçao and Aruba. And then, so that was very arbitrary, very under the radar again. And we know that there was a start of no visa policies following the death of Trujillo, and then waves of immigration, mostly from the 1980s. That's sort of the general picture. What I want to share with you again is what other scholars wrote about these passport restrictions, that they served the elite, and that there were all sorts of ways around it, but still it was strict. That's what Lauren Darby and Jesse Hoffman-Garskov found in their scholarship. What I found against that background was, on one hand, a Dutch tailor and his family who moved apparently to the Dominican Republic, had lived there for a few decades, and they really wanted to come back in 1940, and they wanted some support of the consul. And then in that same year, there was this communication between Santo Domingo and The Hague about Dominican sex workers, because some of the regulations changed and there was some concern about whether that would continue, yes or no. So who was hot and who was not? Well, guess, who do you think was most wanted in Curaçao and Aruba? That's an easy one. In the case of the Dutch tailor, it was said, no, we cannot support you because we do not want to create a precedent. And in the case of the sex workers, it was a continuous laissez-faire without any change. If you look at the Curaçao archives and what I found there, and Aruba, I found all sorts of documents implying a schedule, even before later on there would be a government schedule that we know of, and that Chelsea wrote a wonderful book about. Well, she wrote about a book about many wonderful things, but this is one of the elements. But this was already there. 45, there was these early signals of making this government schedule. And I also found the classic middleman that you find in so many islands. But this, of course, is interesting when you know about these passport restrictions, that I found evidence of someone from the Dominican Republic being active in the Caribbean and on Aruba in just finding jobs and moving people from the Dominican Republic to Aruba, to Curacao, to work there in all sorts of jobs. And then, like I said, the sex worker scheme. Only Japan and Curacao have this regulator scheme for sex work. There is an article written about this with the telling title of The State as a Pimp. And it was not just the state, it was also the Catholic Church being one of the formal partners establishing this hotel next to the airport. And this was for a concern for moral decline and sexual health, with a lot of American Navy people on the island. And if you've been to the Caribbean, you know, these city centers are really crammed, so everyone could see everything. That was sort of the complaint. What I found in the archive was heavy policing throughout these decades, heavy policing. And even perhaps when it was not necessary, if any idea, if you find these are from the immigration archives from Aruba, and I would find these red P's everywhere. Any idea what a red P would stand for?
Prostitute.
Exactly. And even in situations where I would think, why You know, why would you want to do that except for putting a stigma on someone? Or there would be a picture, and then it would say the source of this is, I don't know what it's called in English, the zedenpolitie. So that's the police. Thank you. Vice squad. Okay. Now you know what type of series I don't watch on Netflix. Vice squad. Okay. But this is very interesting. And if you know small islands, you can understand why. Because the ladies with a P, they enter with a name like, well, Martinez. I hope there's not a Martinez here in the room. And then they would return to Santo Domingo. They would come back as Martinez, return, and then suddenly they were La Cruz, or any other typical Aruba name. So they married into, and then they of course became part of Aruban society or Curacao society. And so there is policing, yes, and at the same time, again, under the radar, and if you know the Caribbean, lots of things happen under the radar. There's this blending in again. And again, a lot of moral issues and dilemmas. So if you take this map from the wonderful book by Jesse Hoffman-Garshkov, The Tale of Two Cities, if you don't know this, it's about Santo Domingo and New York. And when I saw this map, I knew I had to do the research for the southern part of this ellipse, because we know there was so much movement from the Dominican Republic to New York, but there also was this steady stream and a structural flow going south. People, of course, diplomats and expats, much more than you would expect, also with the passport restrictions. Which small island needs 15 diplomats? One point of time. Individuals with passports did arrive on a larger scale than you would assume. I don't have numbers, very hard to get numbers, but it's much more than you would assume. Individuals on the new visa scheme, and then a lot of individuals that I found in the archives who claim Dutch citizenship, and that was quite easy. So if you were born in San Pedro and your father was from St. Martin, you could come to Aruba and just get a passport, very easy. And then the sex workers, of course. So there was this constant and structural flow south. That's understudied.
When you said they come from San Pedro or the other city, are they coming from the Dominican Republic?
That's a very good question. Yeah, generally they come from the Dominican Republic. When I say San Pedro, I refer to being fathered.
Oh, that city, San Pedro the Macoris?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
San Pedro the Macoris, yeah. And then, yeah, I refer to the former sugar workers that fathered children there. And if the children could claim that relationship, then they could claim citizenship. But they, of course, very good question. They came from mostly these two harbors, Santo Domingo and San Pedro de Macoris. So where I am now is and that's the title of this talk. The Dutch arranged for mass labor immigrations for oil and for the brother, and they were heavily policing that, both at the front door, but also in the refinery on Curaçao, etc. There was heavy policing. At the same time, apparently, the back door was open, because what happened to these 700 people in San Pedro? And there must have been much more. On the other hand, the same for Trujillo. There were travel restrictions, but there is evidence of a steady flow of Dominican labor and family migration. And this is very interesting. If you know the culture of the island, then you understand why certain types of music, for instance, were popular way before the 1980s. And like we discussed, like I expected, I did find a lot of elements of morality and ideology. I did find activism, so the people in Garveyism, etc., but also I found this right-wing elite and missionary church leadership in various roles. But their power position was never challenged. So there was a more awareness, political awareness on an individual level, but still this power position was not challenged. And that would be challenged in 1969 by eruption of violence on the island. There was not much anti-colonial, demonstrations or anything happening on the island.
The missionaries always kept.
Yeah, and this was my dissertation, so don't get me started. But the Netherlands is Protestant, and Catholicism was a minority. So when I moved to Curacao in 2008, that was one of the first questions I had. Why is this area so Catholic? And that's how I started my research on that. But
To read that.
and yeah, it's and I think this really is of importance, not just for people studying the Dominican Republic or the Dutch Caribbean, but this is very much telling something about community formation and Black diaspora. So for further research, I really need to do more work, and Chelsea is also always a wonderful source for this in connecting to other discourses. And I think we will be having a conversation about this as well. So a lot of work to do there. What I think I'm working on are at least 3 new narratives in historiography. And one is that this part of the right-wing connections of the Curaçao elite and the way they acted in getting this school in the Gabon. It's very interesting. The letting go of Caribbean citizens, I think, is a new narrative, both for Dutch Caribbean historiography, if I still may use these terms, and for Dominican studies, and also the radicalization outside Dutch Caribbean. That is sort of an unexpected bonus that I will be publishing on. And this is where I think I leave you. Thank you so much. How are we doing this? Are we going to sit down or stand up, or?
Yeah, if we both sit here, we're not very visible to you all, right? So
I think you can sit.
okay. All right, well, my role is just to give you all a minute to come up with your own brilliant questions while I fill the space with some queries of my own. So it's really wonderful to be back at my alma mater and with friends, new and old, people who've been really important in my own intellectual journey. So thanks for being here. And thank you, Margo, for sharing this. It is so vulnerable making to present a work in progress. And thank you for inviting us into your thought process. It's great to see how something of this scope takes shape. So I thought I would begin with a question of historiography. And it often seems that those of us working in Caribbean studies or the history of the Caribbean are often trying to catch up to the lived realities of Caribbean people and the way that Caribbean people have moved, right? So obviously studying mobility has been a longstanding preoccupation of Caribbean scholars, and the effort to try to chart mobility as a cultural, economic practice of survival and a practice of survival for oneself, but also for one's kin. That's been taken very seriously in our field, but it is also constantly thwarted by the organization of archives, by the assumption that people stay in their imperial boundaries. And so a number of things have made that challenging to do historiographically or methodologically, I should say. And certainly in looking at the scholarship on the Dutch Caribbean context, there are a few brilliant examples, like the work of Rosemary Allen, Tacuba Nostabai, We're Going to Cuba, and her work on the British Caribbean and the way that people move from the British Caribbean to Curacao. But there's a lot more to be done on this terrain, and I think that's a brilliant intervention that your emerging project is making. So I guess I wonder, could you position yourself a bit in these studies of mobility? Is this where you see yourself intervening? And if so, are there kind of generative distinctions in your work from the many recent studies that we've seen on labor migration, for instance, to sugar enclaves, banana enclaves, the Panama Canal Zone? So.
Yeah. Thank you, Chelsea. Yeah, it's funny when you sort of position me in the new work on labor migration, because I would not consider myself so much being in that field. Of course, I study labor migration, but my lens is so different. And my lens, of course, comes from my positioning. And my positioning is not just as a historian, it's very much as a Caribbean historian, Caribbean scholar, working with material that's scattered around the place and that's scarce. So it's, you could say it's a creative use of sources. It's also being resourceful in getting the picture. When I think about, you know, studies of labor migration, I think of people, and I know there, but with getting this sort of general picture with all the details and the quantities and, you know, everything is there in order. I don't have that luxury. If I would have wanted to write a labor migration study, that would be very hard, because I cannot come up with that sort of overall detailed picture. And I know that the ones that you refer to also are, of course, going beyond these sort of old school lines, but just to reflect on how that work sort of does not sort of, I don't feel the connection too much. For me, though I'm not an anthropologist, I feel very much called, if I can use that very missionary word, to shift the perspective from what I've been raised with, the traditional, very geopolitical way of studying the Dutch Caribbean and the Caribbean in general, and shift the perspective to, just like Rosemary Allen, to what was it like for people. There's a lot of imagination in that as well. The imagination of when you go through all these lists, these shipping lists, and you need to imagine what was it like. You know, you need to paint the scene like I did in this presentation to understand why what you find on paper is on paper the way it is. And I do that not only because I need to, because there's not so much material. I do that not only because it feels very much like urgent to do that, to add that perspective. I do that also because I think I consider myself an activist as well as a scholar. And I think it's a way of doing people justice and going beyond there being temporary workers like entities in this business, but, you know, people of real flesh and blood who, once they got that opportunity, spoke up for themselves. The agency, I think, is very important in my work. And this is a very reflective answer, but you know me.
Yeah, I think your comments about imagination raise two questions for me. One is about the anthropologist Vanessa Agar-Jones has this beautiful article with the Sands, remember, from a few years ago, where she talks about attending to the specificity of place in the Caribbean instead of this kind of axiomatic focus on mobility. And I think there's certainly a lot of imaginative work to be done in imagining these two different sites that you're thinking, or three rather, four actually, people leaving from St. Martin, people coming to Aruba, people going to Curacao, people in the Dominican Republic, that are all, I mean, these sites they have some commonalities in that there are overlapping spheres of imperial and corporate powers here, but they also have their distinctions in terms of what did it mean to live in these spaces? And I wonder if that is something that you're interested in sort of fleshing out the real differences in the ways, for instance, that racial regimes are managed in a place like Aruba than in the sugar towns of the Dominican Republic. And then thinking also about imagination, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about how you are reading and approaching these documents. It's clear from what you've presented, you know, that you're tracking people's names as they change. You're looking for these fragments, which, you know, Caribbean feminist scholars have done so much creative work to figure out how to strain against the archive or to read along the bias grain, as Marisa Fuentes says, to try to ethically attend to the lives that emerge in the margins of these records. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us how that work is done for you.
Yeah, there really is not much archival material. Let me stress that again. So it's not when you say reading against, or, you know, I know that work, it's very much, I'm here with just bits and pieces. And what I could not do this work, I think, if I had not done this very thorough study of the Dutch Caribbean and where people came from. You know, when you look at the, and understanding their sense of belonging, and their sense of self-worth in this racist, patriarchal environment. So it's, yeah, but so I see elements in several of the things that you, of the scholars and scholarly approaches that you mention. But there's also an element of luxury in it that I don't have. It's the resourcefulness comes first in getting all these bits and pieces, and then trying to place them in a lot of secondary literature, like April May's study. It's very important to understand San Pedro the Macoris environment. And also, if you say place or site, it's very important that on both situations, in both contexts, sites were created in a sense of the oil villages. Well, it wasn't like a prison, but they were very, you know, enclosed in several ways and segmented in several ways. So it was a very controlled environment. The sex workers also were in a very controlled environment in sites. Going to these places and trying to, again, being intuitive in approaching your sources. I don't have much ego documentation. Like Rosemary Ellen, she went to Cuba in the 80s, so she could interview people for me. And if any one of you has grandparents still alive, or, you know, I did interview one 19-year-old lady in San Pedro, but it's really scarce. So it's
well, thinking about, that doesn't work. That would be a good start.
Creating the buzz, I think.
Oh.
Yeah, it is.
So we'll just share. speaking of the kind of scarcity of materials, which of course I think many of us have confronted, and especially people working on, pre-20th century histories are quite familiar with. You've written previously, as you said, your prior work focusing on the Dutch Caribbean was sort of crucial to launching this project. And you've written previously on the relative erasure of the Dutch Caribbean from Caribbean studies. Oftentimes the reason that's offered for that is one of language. Oh, Dutch, it's no one knows Dutch, but obviously people learn languages all the time to do research. So that rationale has never felt quite right to me as a reason why the Dutch Caribbean ends up somewhat marginalized in Caribbean studies. And so could you tell us maybe a bit, why do you think this erasure exists? And then institutionally, as well as intellectually, what can be done? I mean, it's clear how you are bringing the Dutch Caribbean into conversation with other parts of the region, again, catching up to how people actually lived. But I'd love to hear you reflect on that.
Well, thank you. And Eric Williams would so agree with you. He went to The Hague and he went to all places when he wanted to. Eric Williams, the former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, he was a historian, which is a very good way of getting a career started, I think. And he was very focused on getting this inclusive history written of the Caribbean. And he went to all places. He went to The Hague and he did get all sorts of sources and the money to translate the sources. So there's no excuse for any of us following his footsteps. This erasure in the essay that I wrote for Small Eggs, I approached the erasure of the Dutch Caribbean or the neglect in Caribbean studies by looking at the intellectual production coming from the Dutch Caribbean and the intellectual production in this era of Eric Williams, of decolonization of the 40s and the 50s, when people met and read each other's work and, a lot was going on. And I wondered, where were the Dutch Caribbean writers? And if you look at the very small production, you see a very sad story of repression. You see that Anton de Com's work, Wij slaven van Suriname, the English, it was published in 1932. Anton de Com was sent back from Suriname to the Netherlands. He died very young, not seeing his publication really getting attention. And the English version was published last year.
Yeah.
So that's a long time to wait. Some other one, Louise Doudon, an activist also in the early 30s from Suriname, ended up in a psychiatric ward to die there in the 80s without any prosecution or whatever. He didn't know what he did wrong, but that was where he was. And Medard de Marchena from Curaçao, the same thing. He did publish in 1921, was sent eventually to Bonaire, and his business was ruined. So there is this very fierce repression on one hand, little intellectual anti-colonial production, which is understandable. And at the same time, what you see is, I looked at the mirror image as well. So how was this reflected on how the Dutch Caribbean considered itself and how others saw the Dutch Caribbean in that area? Because apparently they were not part of the game. And what you see is there is this sort of pride of we're different, that's instilled in children, even very young. We're different. We're Dutch Caribbean. We're not Caribbean. And I saw that in the archives as well. So, for instance, Eric Williams came to visit, held a lecture in 63, and he said, well, you are, you're like almost autonomous. You have it all. You have the money from the Netherlands, and you have this great political position. So you're there, and I think that has a very long echo, and there's a long road, I think, to go, which starts with looking at that production and looking at that history of repression and acknowledging it. And if that's not done, where do you go? So it has much more to do, I think, with the Dutch Caribbean itself. To put it very, black and white. This was a very, this article is more balanced than I give the summary now, but that's basically what my analysis is.
Well, just being mindful of the time, I know that there are many people eager to ask you questions, so I'll end my interrogation for now and hand it over to the audience. But of course, I can keep going all day if.
Two different, very different questions. So I don't know if there's many people online. So thank you so much, both of you. This is a great discussion. Just yesterday, I was at an event about the DR and Haiti and the current situation, and I'm just thinking of how much the question of citizenship is present in your work too, and how permanent this question is in the DR. So one thing that I mentioned yesterday was if you want attention in the DR, you either talk about migración or pelota. So it's baseball or immigration, and you're going to get everyone's attention. So I was wondering to what extent in the middle of visa policies and passport restrictions and name changes and all the scenario that you portray there, you're interested too in the political appeal of immigration as a question for Trujillo, as a question that calls the attention of the audience and of Dominicans in general, because of how contentious it is. So to what extent the political appeal is something that makes citizenship be a question that is so present in the DR when it comes to national identity, when it comes to defining Dominicanidad or who we are as a people. The second question that is not really connected, or maybe it is, but if you can contextualize it a little more on what was going on in the world at this period, because you began mentioning the Cold War. And I'm really interested, you mentioned the church, for instance, and in 1961 is Mater and Magistra, and when we're really discussing liberalism and the Pope is basically saying private property is fine, let's do whatever we want. So you're talking about the Dutch oil in also this context of church going there in a moment when the church is really revisiting all this discussion of labor and industrialization and development and saying, profiting is fine. So how the question of labor, to build on what Chelsea asked first, becomes one in the context of the Cold War and of liberalism as a almost church policy too. These are my two questions.
Loud. Probably not for anybody else.
Just my Latina belt. No, not the microphone. Probably. Sorry.
The citizenship and passport. If I look at that question from where I am now in my research, my focus very much is on the individual experience that I try to sort of see in there. So not so much the scholarly discussion, because I come from hearing stories and seeing the presence of people from the Dominican Republic and Curacao that I try to sort of place in time and understand how did they end up here. And then I think not so much the citizenship or Dominicanidad or anything comes up in this group, but to me the first word is entrepreneurship of individuals just bettering their lives, trying to move, and once they are in Curaçao or Aruba and they get that all arranged, and then continue their life and build their business and their life. That's the focus of my, in my current sources and in my own thinking about what happened there. Not so much the belonging Dominicanidad citizenship part. On the other hand, if I may jump to the current situation, which I usually do not because I'm a historian, there has always been a very, very active Dominican association on both islands. So a very strong ties of being connected. And you see that in the fiestas as well, and in the church, in sports as well, in baseball. So culturally, yes, there was this sort of new bond on the islands. Yeah. So that's relative to your first question. And liberalism in the early 60s, I can tell you a lot about that from the Dutch Caribbean. Are you interested in the Dutch Caribbean?
Always, yes.
Okay. That was what happened in the Dutch Caribbean is that there was a very conservative leadership of the Catholic by the Catholic mission, and that changed somewhat in the late 1930s and 40s, and apparently there was a lot of there were many initiatives to bring back conservatism in the church in the late 1940s, and they were very successful in doing that. So when all these changes started to happen, especially in 62 and with the Vatican Council, this was all kept outside. And if you look at it from a more theological perspective, I always wondered why I didn't see any traces of liberation theology and on the island. And one of the things that I found in my research that was deliberately kept out. So there were some progressive priests, but they were like, you always have these people, but they were not in power positions. So that the fact that the church made these moves in the mid-40s and had these friendships and ties, apparently with the Dominican Republic, that wasn't a surprise to me. But that is very much a small group of conservative Catholic leadership on the island, being very powerful, and they were powerful because they were supporting the oil. And the oil industry was supporting them. And that had very much to do, and again, this is much more your field of expertise than mine, very much to do with, policing maybe is a strong word, but controlling family situation, wanting men to marry women and have children and be very Catholic, and that was a very big thing of the whole society for these decades, and that changed somewhat in the 70s, but not in this in the period I now study. Yeah.
I don't really have a question, but your presentation, or when I saw the title, it really caught my attention because I never connected Dominican Republic, Curaçao, even though I go there a lot in Aruba because I have family there. So I'm from San Pedro the Macoris, and all my grandparents came from the islands, and I do have one of my grandmother from my father's side. She is considered Dutch, but she came from St. Thomas when I think the Dutch was in charge. So when it turned to American, it was already in DR. And recently, like 6 of my aunts got the Dutch citizenship, so they are like in the Netherlands. So like everything that you mentioned is like a picture of what my life has been, and even in the community. My grandparents had to pay taxes every month, every year, I think it was, and everything is like registered. We have like all the books where they register and write the names and all this stuff. So never connected in that side, but I also like look to my mind like a lot of friends that we have migrated to Aruba, even one of my aunts, and I used to visit a lot. So it was very interesting and it's like you talking about my life.
Thank you so much. This is so wonderful. As a historian, when you move out of the archives and suddenly you have your history there in the flesh. So thank you so much. And about the St. Thomas connection, that's really interesting. What happened there is that the Jewish families from Curacao, the merchant families in the 1880s, they had to move and to find new ways of, earning money. And some of them went to St. Thomas, and a lot of people from the Dutch islands followed and worked for them, or, there were so many connections and it's relatively close. So many people from St. Eustatia went to St. Thomas and back. So this movement, even though St. Thomas never was a Dutch island, but the movements were there and the connections were there. So it very much makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
I was really interested in your focus on ideology or ideological and moral dilemmas as like corollary to the act of migration. But I was wondering if those explain the migration, because, for example, you were telling us about how the people blend in the DR, but I was wondering, okay, why are they here in the first place? And is it always because of labor or economic reasons, or can those moral or ideological tensions maybe also explain their material?
Well, thank you so much for that question, because that's at the heart of my research, and it's both. I think there must be elements of ideology and morality, but I'm open to all sorts of configurations, and I think that now I'm sort of getting a better picture. I see that people just move because their neighbor moved or their brother or whatever, and once they're in this different context, then ideology starts to, and for instance, the ideology of being in an environment without discrimination. I think that sort of as an idea, just a political awareness developed once they were out of their own where they came from. So it could be both. And also people moving because of ideology. But I think it was much more just survival mode and being confronted with all sorts of new challenges. But again, for everyone, we're now emphasizing the sort of labor migrants, just the men on the street. But I'm studying also people like this priest and also the sex worker, so that's where also morality comes in. Yeah, so I'm open to everything. I think it was both. It was both like the entry point and the result. Yeah.
Is the Dutch connected only to the sun? Because it's true. Yes. Is the Dutch connection only to San Pedro the Macoris, or does it go north, or do they remain in what you've read within the San Pedro the Macoris boundaries? My parents are from La Vega, La Vega and Salcedo, Cibao mostly.
Yeah.
So I'm noticing the patterns of the ports have a huge influence as to why people settle and migrate back and forth. The entrepreneurial spirit, as you mentioned, a better way of life. And just to understand whether or not that influence continued going north.
Yeah, the north became the context with the north, and the activities in the north were earlier in the tobacco. So many of the Jewish merchants that I already mentioned, they were active in the Cibao and in the tobacco. So it very much, it fluctuates through times. People, you know, like you say, they go after opportunities. And the reason that I now focus on San Pedro the Macoris was that in this era that I studied, and I approach this as case studies. So for me, San Pedro is a case study because this is where the political activism and the with the Garveyism, etc., erupted, and that's when most Dutch Caribbean people were in the Dominican Republic in one space, and this all happened. And also because many, not all, but many of the sex workers came from San Pedro the Macoris. So that was really a center with like you say, the harbor, you know, being an important place. Yeah. Michiel Bout wrote a lot about the earlier period and the Dutch there. Yeah.
Spoke briefly about the lack of literary production. Can you talk about the representation of the sugar workers and labor? The representation of labor in visual arts or visual works.
In the Dominican Republic or the Dutch Caribbean? The Dutch Caribbean. The Dutch Caribbean, art in the Dutch Caribbean for a long time was a very colonized space. So art history, but also heritage, the approach of heritage and monuments and everything. And even in 1948, when the first museum was opened, it was all Dutch art because that was real art. And all the other elements, all the other productions were considered folklore. I think you have that on most of the islands that there, you know. And you see a change of that from the 60s. When there is this development of naive, what's called naive art. I apologize if I don't use the, it feels like a, yeah, like a terrible. And there were the links that I found there, but that was for a different article I wrote, were with Haiti. So the artists were in contact with, not with the Caribbean, because the Dutch Caribbean are not used to feelings too Caribbean, but these artists were in touch with the, and in the work of, for instance, Ocalia, you see a full representation of everyone on the island, and there was more of this work. So there you see that, but much later on. There have been some Dutch artists visiting, portraying like life in the harbor, and in the 20s, where you would also you would see a reflection of the island. Yeah. Is that sort of answering your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I can ask you more later.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, and I'm sorry that my next question is just going to show how abysmal my ignorance of Brazilian society is, but I think I still did not understand why Curacao needed to import, so to speak, sex workers. There are no sex workers in Curacao.
This is a very good question. It has a lot to do. Do you want to answer, Chelsea?
Sure.
This is a conversation. And it's about your wonderful book.
Well, there were women who sold commercial sex on Curaçao for sure, but the Dutch colonial government had some anxieties about women selling commercial sex, specifically because they believed that Afro-Curacao women were not desirable, especially during World War II, as US American soldiers arrived to defend the refineries. And so there was a kind of double perceived threat to Dutch colonial elites who, when Americans arrived on the island, who were not familiar with the gradations of color in the Caribbean that assigned status in those societies. And so those men, the soldiers disembarking to take care of the oil industry, were soliciting the wives and daughters and sisters of the elite. And so, and reportedly, some of them welcomed those advances. So they faced a kind of dual threat to the kind of colonial racial hierarchy, and then, of course, their own wounded masculine pride. And so the idea was that one could, protect the honor of local white womanhood through this state-supported scheme to import sex workers. That did not mean that local women weren't sex workers. It just shunted them into sex work was legal on the island. It is legal, but they were not permitted to work in that state-run brothel that opened in 1949. So it shunted them into more like informal spaces of selling commercial sex, and largely, in the working class fence line communities that surrounded the Shell refinery on Curacao.
Can I ask you a question?
This is your day.
No.
There's another question.
Okay.
Yeah, there's someone in the back.
I'm just curious about now that you've heard this and knowing so much about this part of Curacao history and Aruba history. Did you hear anything that was new or that sheds a new light on your own work or that you don't agree with? Or
That's a hot potato. I have learned a lot. I mean, I think the one thing I might say is that, you made a subtle distinction, I think, in response to Mila's question, that you're looking at labor migration and sex worker migration. And I would say sex worker migration was labor migration. And it functions according to basically the same exact principles of labor migration to support the oil industry, in the sense that those industries, the kind of mobile practice of oil companies throughout the world was to rely on a flexibilized labor force that could be easily deported. Just like you said, Louis Dodul gets sent back to Suriname. This happened all the time from the oil refineries on Aruba and Curacao. The idea was that if someone posed a political problem, they could just be sent home, and that if they brought kin, that would make it a lot harder to do that. So sex worker migration upheld that whole calculus of labor migration, which created huge profits for these oil companies. So I think that those streams of migration need to be sort of studied in tandem. I think they're one and the same, in my view.
Are you doing?
I'll-
I was going to just
You're good.
here for you guys too. Yeah.
So, thank you for sharing. My dad worked in Curaçao for a number of years, so some of the stories are very familiar for me. He worked for Shell. My question is, looking at sex work industry, what will have you been able to measure, or did you take into consideration measurement of the economic impact back in the Dominican Republic through remittances?
It's a great question, and I can just briefly answer no. I have not yet looked at that. I'm just sort of painting pictures and looking at the big sort of movements and trends.
So the trend continues. There's still movement of sex workers to different islands, and I'm from Dominican. The come from Dominica separate from Dominican Republic, and the industry has moved and shifted to Antigua and for the Caribbean, and you see the money transfer offices on the weekends, long lines of workers sending money back.
Yeah, I can imagine that that is part of Kamala Campedou's work, who did a lot of looking at sex in the Caribbean throughout several decades, and well, I think she covered with her team lots of elements. It's interesting to look at that. Yes.
Okay, I had a question about the sex workers that were going to Curacao. Were those members of the native Dominican population, or were they members of the Anglophone migrant population in San Pedro?
As far as I know, they were part of the native Dominican population. Yeah.
Okay. Shy, I just feel ignorant because I just don't know who was there first, who was living in these three islands first. Weren't there indigenous?
Yeah.
And I just need a little bit of background.
Yes. There were, the Caquetillos were first on the Leeward Islands. Well, yeah, and and then in the early 16th century, the majority of them were sent from Curacao to what was then called La Española, Haiti, to work in, I think it was in deforestation, in the wood and other work, and some groups were brought back to the islands because the Dutch islands were known as the Islas Initulas, pardon my Spanish, the useless islands, and so it was considered, you can just take people from there and bring them to some other place where they can work, because these dry islands are of no use. But when there was some development of some, these are not plantation economies, Curacao. So Curacao in particular became of economic importance to empires because of they were a hub for the slave trade, so later on there was some mix of being indigenous people being brought back to the islands, but just very, very few.
I have a question about the very end of your presentation where you mentioned that there was activism. That's one of the areas you want to contribute to. If you could just tell us a little bit more about that, I'm really curious.
Yeah, the activism that I refer to was found in people like Philip van Putten and the Cooks and Adrian Richardson. So people that I could trace that were of Dutch Caribbean origin and that became active mostly in Garveyism. So so that's what happened. Yeah, that was in the early 20s, and there's a wonderful, Huberto Muniz wrote a wonderful book about Garveyism in the Dominican Republic and how that was linked. Both there were these interlinkages of all these communities or all these people from the Caribbean coming together and blending into this one community. And to my surprise, Dutch people from the Dutch Caribbean were not only part in that, because they're not known to be too, politically active at that point of time because of the repression that I talked about. But they were also at the front. So the Philip van Putten was a reverend at the church, and he was one of the founders of the chapter in San Pedro the Macoris of the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And that mere fact, plus the demonstrations very early on in 2021, were enough for the governing bodies then, the US military, to just send him. Well, he was threatened to be expelled, but then he chose himself to come to New York, and so did James and Alice Cook. So it was quickly repressed, but it was there, and I think that once they were in New York and bringing up their little son Carlos Cooks, Unfortunately, again, it's not like the archives are, filled with material evidencing what happened then, but you can just make the assumption that they remained active, and they must have also, looking at the harbor strike occurring in Curacao in 1922, that there must have been, like always in the Caribbean, these streams of under the radar communications and information. And I also assume that the Negro World was read on the islands, but I've never seen a copy. So there was, with the Catholic Church, with the repression, you have this island where 85–90% is Afro-Curacao Catholic. And you have this elite and this business interest that is developing when the oil refinery is established on the island. Then everything is being done to keep this group at distance from what was going on in the growing industry and in the sort of modern life, and people coming in who had better housing and everything. So that's very much the story of Curacao. So it's not like you would easily share or manifest your criticism of that. That was really dangerous. Yeah.
So my question is in relationship to the documents that you shared at the beginning of the presentation with the names. I think that's something really interesting there. And